Hey man, how y'all doing? It's Virtue, and I've cooked up a pretty interesting topic for you guys today, and I don't think I've really seen anyone talk about. Of course, judging by the title and thumbnail, it's what if Obito actually attacked another village? The chapter 500 reveal that the masked man was behind the death of the 4th Hokage was a shocker to many fans, including myself. Jiraiya always expecting it was Madara Uchiha, with nobody really there to witness it. However, what isn't noted is that Obito actually attacked the strongest village, implied in the fanbook as well as the databook status. So, what would happen if Obito infiltrated another village, capturing their tail beasts and attempted to kill the respective Kage of that village? If you know your series well, however, then you know that Konoha is one of the few villages that doesn't possess a second Biju. The only villages for that being Konoha and Suna and Takigakure, but we'll talk about that later. However, since we only will be discussing the 5 great nations, Takigakure's 7 tails will be in the hands of Amagakure, the rain village. And yeah, let's jump straight into this, moving alphabetically off of that. Amagakure, the village hidden in the rain. Now possessing these 7 tails, how does Obito truly stack up in this position? Well, who is in the rain seat of power at this point? Is it the 6 Paths of Pain or Hanzo the Salamander? Well, since we know that Obito interacted with Pain just prior to this attack in 16 years ago and at the time of Shippuden, and Nagato was yet to suffer from the death of his beloved Yahiko, then a few years later, Yahiko was killed via dirty tactics from Hanzo and Danzo. Then, after a few more following years, he kills Hanzo. So, the leader of Amagakure here is most definitely Hanzo. Yeah, there's one thing you need to remember before we discuss Hanzo. He has to stop the 7 tails and then fight Obito. So, just how strong is Hanzo the Salamander? Well, to understand Hanzo, we need to understand how he earned his reputation, which, if you haven't heard already, is essentially just bringing the Rain Village out of poverty and suffering to face a far more militaristic, dominant country. The Second Great War was when a majority of the fighting for him occurred, in which his dream was to unite all the great nations under his rule. The Sannin, being Orochimaru, Tsunade, and Jiraiya, earned their respective reputations not from beating Hanzo up, not killing him, but simply surviving a fight with Hanzo the Salamander. Therefore, he dubbed them the legendary Sannin of Konoha. Now, Naruto is really ambiguous with their prime characters. Many examples like Mifune or Hiruzen, which has some crazy lore in his prime, but in my opinion, considering the typical prime age range for characters being around their middle age, the Sannin being over 50 with that age being implied to be a key factor in strength decrease, with Tsunade actually confirming her Part 1 self wasn't her prime as implied against Kabuto. So yeah, going under the assumption that the Sannin are equals, and as many medians imply that as well, Hanzo alone was once above the 3 Sannin in their prime, or at least being generous above them all individually. This would be a more prime Orochimaru than the Part 1 variant who combated Hiruzen Sarutobi, who even as an old man is above all 5 Kage with his Edo Tensei feats. Also, like supporting as much. It could be implied that the Sannin are on the level of old Hiruzen, especially if you imply that they are equals, considering that old Hiruzen is stated to be equals to Orochimaru. Therefore, Jiraiya is also near that level, when just the idea of Hanzo being defeated made him more scared than we've actually ever seen the Toad Sage. He was sweating with his pupils dilating, so Hanzo is crazy. This isn't all, as we know that Hanzo did fight the 6 Paths of Pain when Hanzo was out of his prime. Hanzo is a character with a drive from dominant ambition, seen in very few leaders. However, throughout his dominance, Hanzo began to lose that drive he once carried, with Mifune implying that he's also nothing more than just a dull blade. So, considering how many years later it was when Hanzo and Pain battled, Hanzo was not at his full power and was likely heavily suppressed. We also know that when fighting Mifune, it's also stated that nobody ever managed to avoid his scythe and sickle before, even though it's not shown that Hanzo, when dying to Pain, it could maybe imply that it caused trouble, but Pain seemingly uninjured, which, doesn't really mean much, honestly, considering the Naraka path. It's virtually impossible to prove that it did harm him. However, getting Hanzo to that Pain level is not that difficult when considering how Sage Mode Jiraiya fought Pain. That fight in particular is one of those misunderstood fights that I might actually cover, so I'm not going to allude to it too much, but Jiraiya is able to Perception Blitz Pain with the Resolve Amp, and is shown being able to react and catch his attacks. And he's able to decipher his abilities and nearly beat him via Frog Song, if it wasn't for Pain hiding the other 3 bodies. from Jiraiya, which the weekly release and Pain himself imply a very similar idea that the fight was very difficult and Pain would not have won if he didn't hide those bodies. Does this really put him straight up over Pain? No. However, it does simply lend credence to the idea that Hanzo could be relative to a Pain, far closer to his full power than the one who bombed the Leaf Village. So yeah, Hanzo is ridiculous. Now, I'm going to come back to his poison in a second, but how does Obito stack up to this? And to be honest, it should be established that Minato is above that Sannin level, as implied several times, which I'll also just throw up on screen, meaning that both Minato and Hanzo are far exceeding that Sannin standard. But does this Obito really scale to Hokage Minato? Well, I just discussed this in my last video, which I heavily recommend you check out, but essentially Minato and Obito are only relative on a low end, with Minato being above Obito, but Obito can still perceive and react to a holding back Minato, which in my opinion does still give Obito at least a slight speed advantage. Here, as Minato does monologue about Obito within his serious light and does not get caught off guard, or it does get caught off guard, about how fast Obito really is, compared to his normal speed, which Hanzo, again, is above that Sannin level and maybe on that Pain level, depending how much you highball him. But regardless, saying that Obito wouldn't have an advantage would be rather disingenuous, with him, of course, having Kamui as well. So, how would Kamui interact with the poison? Well, the poison is actually his greatest asset, and it actually counters Kamui, or at least it counters how Kamui interacts in battle, in which... What do I mean? Well, the poison is extremely lethal, and was able to numb Kankuro in an instant. It also cooks up a whole new batch, which is covering portions of a forest, may I mind you, in mere minutes. So let's look at this. If the poison interacts with his arm or something, then yes, his arm would just dematerialize into Kamui. But if all the poison is covering a cloud around Hanzo and his salamander, then Obito cannot really get inside. Even if you argue he can get in for a second, then again, you'd be generous to Hanzo to say that he wouldn't still be able to react to that Obito via his scythe and sickle. Now, I didn't mention that the premise of this is not to win, but they don't really have to kill Obito, but just like Minato, they just have to harm him or scare him enough for a validated retreat. So yeah, Obito's win cons are also defense based with Kamui and then the chains and whatnot. Then with Hanzo's also being very defensive based with the poison covering him in clouds, and then attacking with the sickle. So Hanzo would have just a stylistic edge, but we know that the Kamui timer does reset far easier than the poison timer. So if anything, Obito should have the advantage, and in terms to when in terms of being able to capitalize on a weakness or whatnot, maybe bringing Hanzo into the chains, which are fast, noted. Minato in that instance did not even chance the uses of body flicker, and he just resorted straight up to flying Raijin instead. So since Hanzo may not be able to escape like that, then Obito definitely brings him into the Kamui and BFRs Hanzo. Now, maybe there could be a case where maybe the poison stays and holds it off, but then Obito doesn't really have a reason to stay, and he could just take the Seven Tails instead of fighting Hanzo. Hanzo's just gonna I guess camp and with his poison surrounding him, and just hey, if you're not gonna attack the Seven Tails, then he's mine. Forcing Hanzo to play like a more offensive game, I guess, if you will. But Obito would still counter the chain and sickle with Kamui. So I think generally, as much as I hate to say it, Hanzo does lose this match, and my boy Obito does take him out just due to the advantage presented. Now again, I have to keep saying this, but it is extremely close. So if you do think the poison is just a little too much or could last a little too long for the Kamui to really counter, then Hanzo could just poison the Seven Tails and then cure it, since he does carry the antidote with him and somewhat could just restrain the Seven Tails, I guess. And Obito more than likely does take it still. Now, for how Obito could deal with the Seven Tails, that's really simple. Obito would just do as intended, and as he intended to do with Kurama, and just lock the Genjutsu and then just escort him out of the village. So, yeah, for Amagakure, the village hidden in the rain, they do fail to beat Obito, with Obito winning, stealing Takigakure's Seven Tails high difficulty. So, the Stone Village is honestly my favorite one to talk about, if I'm being honest, in which, during the time that Obito invaded, we know that the leader should have been a more prime Ohnoki with the advisors, but characters such as Akatsuchi, Kuretsuchi, and Kitsuchi will be much younger and probably less powerful. Maybe you could argue that Kitsuchi would be more prime there in his teen years, but all that really matters is Ohnoki. which Ohnoki will also have another advantage too, honestly. Not even to just like equal out the battlefield, but to be advantageous, since the Stone Village is one of few that have 2 Bijou, meaning that I'm just going to like say that Obito goes for the 5 Tails, who since he was able to like battle Minato in the Minato Gaiden one-shot, this would be a more prime Han than the Han who fought like Kusame and whatnot, but this leaves the 4 Tails Jinchuriki being Roshi to help aid Ohnoki, whether that be, against Obito or to fight Han. But I think the more likely option is to fight Han, or at least try to like contain him or whatnot. So let's kick Obito versus Ohnoki off with a nice question. How strong is Ohnoki? Ohnoki of the Stone is honestly my best choice for the top Gokage, at least in the moderate fight. Now, why do I say this? Firstly, with speed, Ohnoki is actually arguably the fastest Kage in pure reaction speed, when accounting for the fact that version 2 Raikage was actually being amped by Ohnoki to make him faster via decreasing A's mass, allowing for him to move at much higher speeds. But what people don't talk about is how Ohnoki actually has to react to this A whilst in combat, whilst he's attacking, then increase the mass at the perfect time, allowing for heavier, more powerful hits and whatnot. This obviously means that Ohnoki is able or is capable of like combating an extremely amped V2 lightened A. Ohnoki can also like fly, which granted is slower than his combat and reaction speed, but is still able to like outpace Datara's flight, which honestly, like Datara's flight was able to like combat Gaara and in the air and whatnot. So Ohnoki is above those Kage even as an old man. So with the aid of his more ripe age and his busted particle style, Ohnoki should pose a threat to Obito at face value. Throughout the war, there are many satirical events where Ohnoki's back hurts, but these are actually like a legitimate problem, like being like the reason to why like Ohnoki couldn't like hold up 1 meteor, or he could only hold up like 1 meteor rather than 2 and whatnot, and he's like actually dying because his back hurts. So with that problem like being solved or at least improved upon with Ohnoki's age, Ohnoki's greatest limit is now like circumvented. Moving past that, we know that, again, to reiterate my older points, Obito is relative to a Minato on a low-end degree. So since we know that version 2 Raikage A is stated in the databook to boast a godlike speed not inferior to the Yellow Flash, and Hokage Minato is stated to be the greatest in godlike speed, this would mean that Obito should be on the level of that Raikage A, due to him like not being an equal to Hokage Minato, but rather just both being relative. Granted, I do believe that Obito is more relative, so Obito in his Yellow Mask state should be above that version 2 Raikage level, but would he be on that lightened V2 Raikage level? Well, we just can't really determine that without using like some mental gymnastics and whatnot. But I would be inclined to argue that they could at least be relative, and Obito should be able to like react to Ohnoki's best asset being, of course, his particle style. This is due to the fact that Orange Mask Obito is able to react and use Kamui to get in and then out of the particle style prior to it like crushing Sasuke. The same Obito blitzes version 2 Raikage with Kamui, if you cared to add that into the earlier section. But is Yellow Mask Obito on the level of Orange Mask Obito? Well, surprisingly, yes. I've talked about this a few times before on my channel, but essentially you could argue definitely that like, yes, this like younger Obito is at least on that level or even superior to that older like Obito. In part for a few reasons. First of which is we know that when like Obito fought Minato, once Minato like slams Rasengan into his back, Obito got up and his left arm just fell off with the Zetsu like goo effect, like with the white goo or whatnot. Pause. This being, of course, like the wrong arm to be his like Zetsu Hashirama cell half of his body, meaning that prior to this fight, Obito definitely could have picked up some extra cells, considering the reputation of his former master. Another reason is it's implied that Minato like severely injured Obito in their encounter, and Obito never really recovered, and that's why like we never really saw him like truly engage in battle whilst in Orange Mask and whatnot. So I mean, I guess he like fights like Fu and Torine, but like who are they, you know what I mean? So yeah, this like young 17-year-old Yellow Mask Obito is above the older, more mature Obito who could combat the particle style. So the particle style does unfortunately get countered by Kamui, but the chains also get countered by Ohnoki's flight ability. He could just like fly straight up out of them. So it's somewhat of like a trade-off, I guess. I suppose. Now Ohnoki could still use particle style to kind of like capitalize when the Kamui becomes material, I guess, to kind of work around that timer. So Ohnoki is probably a hair faster than Obito, with him being obviously like physically stronger when taking into account that he was like in a more muscular physical peak than when he was able to hold up an entire meteor, in the sky. And Obito can Kamui out of the particle style. But the attack would still like murder Obito if timed correctly. Ohnoki will not be caught in the chains due to his flight ability, which Obito really has no answer for. So Ohnoki also does have the aid of Han, helping battle down Roshi and whatnot. So even if Ohnoki is beaten, Obito has to fight Roshi as well. So if we're sticking to like the objective, Obito more than likely is forced to retreat and leaves the Stone Village victorious, keeping both of their Bijou. Kicking off the Mist Village bluntly, the Kage that will be in leadership at this point in time should more than likely be Yagura. We know that when Obito lost to Minato only a few years later, he went to go control the Mist Village and warp it into the Blood Mist with, controlling Yagura and whatnot. So you could argue that the third Mizukage was in power at this time, but if we're being real, he doesn't really have anything for scaling, so it's just going to be a little more interesting, I guess, if we talk about Yagura, because he has, I guess, a little bit of stuff. So yeah, Yagura will be the leader of the Mist Village, assuming that Obito obviously isn't in control of Yagura. He doesn't start off with the Genjutsu, you know what I mean? So yeah, the Mist Village is another village with the possession of 2 Bijou, for them, of course, being the 3 and 6 tails, respectively. Doing the same as the last section, just saying that Obito takes these 6 tails, since we know that the 3 tails is within Yagura, with him being one of the few perfect Jinchuriki. This means that during their bout, Yagura will have access to tailed beast bombs against Obito and whatnot, but does not have the 3 tails roaming around to fight the 6 tails and whatnot, being somewhat of a trade-off, I guess, if you will. So yeah, with that being said, Yagura is the most peculiar case on this list for sure, being like that in the anime he beat Itachi and Kisame or whatever, or not Kisame, but like Itachi's partner prior, which is like a Jozu or something. I'll throw it on screen, right? But we're only using the manga, so that doesn't even really count. And his physical stats aren't crazy, but Yagura's main ability is kind of broken. His water style, Water Mirror. The Water Mirror is pretty much an oval rotational mirror that perfectly emulates an oncoming attacker. Once they arrive at a close distance or where he wants to clash, then he hooks the top of the mirror, rotating it a little over 90 degrees. Then the mirror version of the attackers, launch out completely, equaling out the attack. Once the impact is made, the attack is repelled, then the mirrored clones dissipate after the clash or whatnot. Now, in the fourth war, we see that actually Yagura was capable of outperforming KCM won Naruto and Killer P with this attack, and he was able to actually hook it before they can reach him and whatnot. However, this could not really be backskilled to his alive self due to B noting how they fight much differently due to the perception amps granted by the Rinnegan and Sharingan projections. So the problem with Yagura is we can't use his war feats. His fourth databook statements don't do anything, and his mentioning in Sasuke's Sunrise novel also doesn't do anything. So Yagura doesn't really scale anywhere. So I suppose we could just simply discuss real quickly how Obito interacts with the mirror. And if you're being generous to the mirror and granting him the idea that it would just also copy the Kamui, then Obito just runs into himself unexpectedly. And then what happens from there? They just both phase through the chains, or then the clone dissipates, and it's just Yagura versus Obito. And then I think it's very clear-cut that Obito would just pull him into Kamui or kill him. Yagura's potential best asset being the Bijou bomb may not even work, considering that they're in his very own village, so would he even use it? And Obito could just phase through it. This means that the Mist Village could not stop the Masked Man, and Obito will be bringing the Six Tails back to the ghetto Mazo, mid-difficulty. Okay, so deciphering who the Raikage was at this time is actually kind of simple. So we know that when Minato battled the AB combo, they were all Jonin. This being presumably at the start or middle of the war, since we know that B does not yet have facial hair, and at the third Raikage's funeral, he still doesn't, and A vows to protect Kumo even whilst they are in the middle of a war, meaning that A, the fourth, becomes Raikage, sometime towards the latter half of the Third Great War. We also know that exactly once the war concluded with the Kanebe Bridge falling, Minato was named the Hokage. So now A had probably a few years, give or take, of training to hone his skill by the time that Minato really dies. So yeah, I'm just going to give A his later Gokage Sama and early war variant, since I mean, if we just says Jonin A and he's just slightly stronger or something, this would be very uninteresting. Obito would just win again. Since I mean A doesn't really like have V2 unlocked yet. Since like when Minato blitzes him, he's like he outdid my top speed. Yeah, his hair like was still down, resembling the V1 cloak rather than the V2 cloak and whatnot. So, yeah, we actually have the most simplistic route of comparison on this list between the Kage and Obito, since we have Minato as a benchmark. However, before we delve into that, we need to first establish that the Cloud Village has 2 Biju as well, being the 8 Tails and 2 Tails, giving Obito the same thing. He has to capture the stronger one, right? Being the 8 Tails, which now does pose quite a bit of a problem for A, honestly, being that A now loses the additional aid of Killer B in his fight. But also, you could imply that when Matatabi rampages, it's nowhere near the level of Gyuki, since, as stated as much during the funeral, which could mean that Yugito, that like having Yugito there to like fight Gyuki, it may be an extremely difficult fight, or like honestly, Yugito could even be losing on that. Now we could definitely say that maybe a younger C or Dodai would help aid Yugito, making it kind of work and whatnot, or at least be able to hold him off. So yeah, I'm just gonna say that A cannot he can't stall this fight for super long, I guess. And it's gonna be kind of on like a timer, I guess, if that makes sense, due to the strength gap, if you will. So, how strong is A of the Cloud? Well, I think speed is again the main category for A, considering that if we're being honest, Obito by this time does not show any real like physical strength on the level of the Raikage. A being at this time like above the level of Killer B in terms of strength, and is in terms like what has been shown, and he's able to like pop off Kisame's head, you know what I mean, and whatnot, and he's able to overtake KCM1, and Obito just really doesn't simply display anything at all as such, and relies more on his speed and his Kamui. So how fast is A in comparison to the Minato that fought Obito? Well, we know that in the Ford databook it states that it could even overtake even Naruto in his Tailed Beast Chakra mode. It boasts a godlike speed, not inferior to the Yellow Flash. The Yellow Flash, of course, referencing Jonin Minato. But the crucial part here is that V2 posts a godlike speed. Okay, godlike. Which is important in part to Minato's databook, stating that being praised among all ninja as the greatest in godlike speed, which supports the idea that V2 Raikage is on par with Jonin Minato, but Hokage Minato is straight up faster, as he is the greatest in that type of speed comparison. A also agrees with this notion, and he kind of says that there's no Shinobi alive since the fourth Hokage that was faster than him, stating faster. So Minato is above this Raikage at his peak speed, so we know that Obito is on like that low end relative to that Minato, and I would argue that they would be relative in speed, which means that in short, A is fucked. So what do I mean? Well, we saw that when Obito and Minato were like relative, Minato only won because of his speed advantage, so A happens to lack that variable in speed, and Obito should be able to Kamui him. Okay. A also in character is also quite a musclehead, if you will, so A really shouldn't be able to like decipher the Kamui like how Minato did. And I will give credit where credit is due and say that A, if he was caught, he could use body flicker to get out of the chains maybe. In terms like actually understanding how the Kamui functions in regards to like the immaterialization effect, he more than likely has no counter to that. Minato bypassed it with Flying Rising, but a Lariat or Bolt of Pain won't really do anything against that. Again, we also know that Kamui is above the Raikage, since this is a stronger Obito than the one that already phased through a full speed V2A. So yeah, Obito should be able to like Kamui the Raikage. Now, even if you want to say that's too difficult, due to them being like relative in speed, then I mean, okay, Obito still wins, since again, it's implied that Gyuki is above Matatabi, like in terms like a rampage and physical stats and whatnot. So A will not be beating Obito, or at least be beating Obito in time to help the village with fighting Gyuki off. So yeah, the Cloud Village also fails the objective, and Obito will bring the 8 Tails back to the Ghetto Mazo like mid-diff. Last but certainly not least, the sand. So figuring out who was the Kazekage at this time of the Nine Tails attack is kind of difficult. And why do I say this? Well, we know that Chiyo states it was more than 10 years since Sasori killed the third Kazekage after the time skip. But we know that Gaara during part 1 is 12, and Rasa was the Kazekage at the time of his birth. And Obito's attack takes place 16 years after the time skip, meaning that before it would be 13 years ago. So that means a year or so after the Nine Tails attack, Rasa was the Kage. So, since the only statement supporting it being the third being really ambiguous, I'm just going to give it to Rasa and say that he is the leader of Suna at this time. And yeah, Obito's objective will be to capture the One Tails. So, what makes this truly interesting is that it's implied that the Kage was always the one to stop Shukaku's rampages with his gold dust, which means that I have no clue who's going to do that whilst he fights Obito and whatnot. But there won't need to be much on that discussion, and I'll get to that in just a bit. But how powerful is Rasa? Well, he's not as crazy as you might think. Many people love to bring up the idea that Rasa is relative to a warrior Gaara, which is wrong for a few reasons. We can see that when they clash, Gaara is merely holding Rasa's sand up until the Alliance can get over the hill. Then he rips down and overpowers Rasa's gold sand, which, what does all this mean? Well, the reason that people argue it's relative to Gaara's sand is that because in the 5 Kage summit, it blitzes the Raikage, which just doesn't get to Rasa, since we know that even if you say they equaled each other out, even if you say that they were equal, this means that Gaara's is several fold faster due to the idea that the force reaching equality, Rasa's of course having a greater mass due to the gold being infused with the sand, so therefore, for them to be equal and Rasa having a greater mass, then Gaara's sand would have to have an overwhelming advantage in acceleration and speed. So this means that Rasa's sand doesn't scale anywhere, and neither does he. If you would like to say that, okay, well, how would the third Kage do if he was in power at this time? Well, his line of scaling, in which I'm sure you've all heard, also has the same exact idea, and it's just getting him above Rasa, and that's it, according to the third data book. But again, we know that he has magnet release, so in regards to speed, he would also just fall under the same problem. So yeah, the problem I alluded to in the beginning also takes part here as well, considering the fact that nobody else can really stop Shukaku. So Obito does stomp the Sand Village, and Obito takes Shukaku, the One Tails, back to the ghetto Mazo, like low to mid diff. Now, to wrap the whole video up, every village fails to stop the Nine Tails' infamous attack, with the exception of Iwagakure and a potentially Amagakure. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that the third Kage would slam Obito, or maybe Obito would bully Ohnoki? Well, let me know down in the comments below. Also, maybe let me know what you guys want to see next. And of course, maybe if this isn't the first time seeing one of my videos, you've watched it, maybe before or whatnot, it would be greatly appreciated if you guys could just like and subscribe, or maybe check some of my other videos out, as again, it would help it a lot. And yeah, hope you guys are all having a blessed day, and as always, love you guys.